Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dialexicon podcast, a podcast targeted at the youth, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary and social issues, all at an easy and understand and digestible level. My name is Saurish and I'm your host. This week, we're joined by Dr. Carolina Flores, who is currently a President's Postdoctoral Fellow in Philosophy at the University of California, Irvine. In the fall of 2023, we'll join UC Santa Cruz, or University of California, Santa Cruz, as an assistant professor of philosophy. Hi, Dr. Flores. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you. How's it going?
It's been pretty good. I think kicking off the podcast again has been really exciting, and I'm really excited for the conversation that we're gonna have today. Well, I just want to say briefly though, thank you for your time and for being here today. And I asked all of the guests of the podcast this question, but I wanted to ask you as well. How did you get into philosophy, and what stood out to you in philosophy?
Yeah. So I got interested in philosophy when I was maybe 15, 16. It's hard to tell what did it exactly. I had a lot of philosophical questions that annoyed people around me. I was particularly fond of stuff around the mind-body problem, like, are we just our brains? What's the connection between our brains and who we are and our complex, multifaceted everyday experience. I was also, preoccupied about skepticism. How do I know that, you're real and not an hallucination? How do I know that I'm not in the matrix? So I had those sorts of questions. Incidentally, I ended up mostly doing philosophy of mind and epistemology. So I had those sorts of interests. I was exposed to philosophy. I grew up in Portugal, and you have to take philosophy in high school. Which wasn't actually very good or engaging, but it means that there's a culture where people kind of have some sense of what philosophy is. I also fell in love with math, characteristically also for a philosopher as a teenager. I decided to try to go to college in England, and I heard about how you could do math and philosophy, and that sounded great because you could, I was thinking, well, you can read and write and think about these big abstract questions that I'm interested in, and you also get to do math, which I was very into and found kind of very intellectually exciting. I went to college to study math and philosophy, and though I really enjoyed and got a lot of studying math, it kind of wore off for me, whereas I just got more and more interested in various philosophical questions and in kind of delving deeper into them. So that's kind of what happened.
That's awesome. I think even for me, I feel like I'm also getting interested in those types of questions. So I think it's really cool that philosophy is required, at least in those nations. I know United States is one of those few nations that doesn't require philosophy, and so hopefully the Dialexicon podcast is a way for youth to engage in philosophy. But I wanted to get deeper into kind of our conversation topic today, which is on philosophy of mind and specifically cognition, and social philosophy as a whole. But before we talk about that, I kind of wanted to ask an introduction question just to get our viewers acquainted with terminology. What exactly is cognition in general? Is it something that we is it our thoughts? What exactly is that from both a philosophical perspective, but maybe also the cognitive science behind it?
Yeah. So people use the term cognition in kind of two ways, the narrow way and the broad way. When people talk of cognitive science, the use of cognitive there is really broad. It's supposed to be anything that's connected to minds, whether they're human minds, animal minds. It could be also about just kind of information processing and computers and so on. And when we talk about minds in that case, it includes everything that minds do, sort of feeling, thinking, perceiving, all the senses, all of that. So that's one use. There's also a narrower use where people talk about cognition as opposed to perception. So what that means is it's sort of not the bit of mentality or of minds that's about getting information from the external world through your senses or about feeling things or having conscious experiences. It's the bit of the mental processes that are about thinking. So basically, in the narrower sense, cognition just is thinking or thought, as opposed to usually contrasted with perceiving or sensing.
Okay, I mean, I think that makes sense. I think like in general, like cognition is a term that's frequently thrown around. I think like more so in generally to refer to thoughts as well. And I think like a quick Google search of cognition, if you're curious and want to search it up, but it relates like closely to psychology. So
Mhm.
how exactly does philosophy play a role in cognition, and like what is your research focused on in philosophy?
Yeah. Um, so I think of philosophy and psychology as in some ways continuous, or they can be done in a like pretty continuous way. So I think the boundaries can be very porous. In fact, you could think, that psychology only kind of really came on its own at all in kind of the late 19th, early 20th century. And the boundaries are still kind of fuzzy, I think. Um, yeah, so I think of philosophy or some ways of doing philosophy as being a part of cognitive science, which is kind of broader attempt at understanding the mind through different perspectives, using things like computer science, psychology, linguistics, some parts of biology. So yeah, I just see philosophy as like part of a constellation. And with respect to all of this, I think, there's a few general things philosophy does, like it can help us clarify assumptions behind our kind of like empirical theories. It can help us also systematize results, kind of like connect results from different fields and kind of paint a bigger picture with those. I think that's a thing philosophers are well trained to do. Um, it can also, I think, often help us kind of consider big picture implications. So, there might be some set of results on how people do at a bunch of different reasoning tasks. And then there's questions about what does that imply about whether humans are fundamentally rational or not. And so drawing out and considering those sorts of implications, I think of as a characteristic role for philosophy. And also, and this, some of these things, of course, psychologists are also doing, so that's why the boundaries aren't so deep. Also, I think philosophers can be helpful at kind of proposing new frameworks and new hypotheses. So, sort of like proposing the beginnings of new models in which to understand the results that we get about how, say, humans reason or perceive. Another aspect of philosophy that matters for thinking about cognition is epistemology. So, philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, there's these fields that are sort of more about kind of understanding how humans think and how we should describe that, basically. Epistemology is more concerned with the question of like, how should we reason? How should we think? So you might think that it's also an important part of understanding cognition to sort of get at the right rules, to sort of figure out what are the rules for good reasoning so that then we can compare how people are reasoning to those rules. So those are sort of the two main roles I see philosophy as playing here.
That makes sense. And then I guess like just a quick question about maybe like things that philosophy can help in the context of like cognitive science, also psychology, and even neuroscience. Um, is consciousness one of those things? I feel like consciousness is
Yeah.
something that like everything comes together.
Yeah, for sure. And consciousness is very mysterious. Philosophers like talking after David Chalmers of the hard problem of consciousness, where the idea, I think this is a bit mean, where the idea is that everything else about understanding human minds is kind of easy, and like the mystery, ultimately, the deep mystery is like consciousness, like how come that there's something it's like to be like alive and having this conversation. So it's definitely true that consciousness is less well understood. It's kind of less well understood, like what we're trying to explain to begin with, and then it's less well understood, like how that could result from either sort of kind of like algorithms, or from just a sort of like watery mush that we have inside our heads. So that's kind of a place where philosophers have played like a really big role in proposing like different models and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think also like in general, and I guess this leads into the next question is about like the way in which philosophers are able to like analyze specific cognitive functions in different domains, which maybe psychology might not do, right? And so specifically like on your paper titled "Belief in Social Change," I guess like I'm curious about the way in which, or like the problem at least of resistant social change, and why that may be harmful to producing social goods. So could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. I'm just going to say say something about my research in general, because I totally forgot to say that in answer. Like I got lost in the first part of the question. So yeah, my research is pretty broad. One reason I love philosophy is because it really allows you to think about whatever you want every day of your life, which is quite cool. You can like switch around a fair bit. But broadly, I'm interested in how cognition or thought can be hijacked in ways that contribute to the perpetuation of oppressive social structures. And I'm interested in what we can do to fight back. So like, so far, I've mostly focused on understanding things like evidence resistance, like why people don't change their minds, what that tells us about human rationality, more generally on like belief change and how people interact with information or evidence. And then this will come up later, but I'm also like extremely interested in questions about the cognitive role of, or like the role in thought of social identities and the sort of how we think about social groups. So those are sort of like some really general themes. And like this matters because so the paper or the project you're talking about is a project where I'm concerned with beliefs that are hard to change by offering evidence or new information. And so they're resistant in that sense. They're also resistant in the sense that they function as a source of resistance to social change. And I mean, like, obviously, I have my views about what good social change is, but I think anyone who's interested in any kind of social change is going to face an aspect of this problem, which is that people have certain beliefs that will lead them to kind of resist structural changes in society. So I can give you an example of that. This comes from like the new Jim Crow. One issue that arises in connection with racial justice, and in particular mass incarceration of like Black and brown people in the US, has got to do with kind of how people fail to get reintegrated into the labor market. So they kind of like get out of prison and they struggle to get jobs. So a lot of states have a requirement, or employers can have a box where they ask people if they've basically ever been to prison. And you can imagine that it's like, this doesn't actually help people get hired. If you say yes on that box, you're not super likely to get a call back. And given that it's mostly Black and brown men who spend time in prison, this means that they then find it like harder to get jobs, which perpetuates kind of like racial injustice. Okay, so here's one proposal. You might think, okay, what if we just made it illegal to ask if people have been to prison? Then employers wouldn't have that bit of information, so they wouldn't be able to discriminate based on that. Seems like a really good idea on many grounds, but it doesn't work as well as you might think if your goal is kind of addressing racial injustice. The reason being that when you remove that, employers are likely to kind of just discriminate against Black and brown men in general. So before, they sort of like selectively discriminated against Black and brown men who'd been to prison. Now they sort of discriminate more generally. So the end result is that it's not actually that much, the end result in terms of inclusion in the labor market isn't that much better. And so the problem here is that you have a kind of structural measure, so removing this box on job forms. And you'd hope that it could work at really changing the world, but people's kind of resistant racist beliefs in this case lead the measure to not succeed. So sort of like you change social structures, but beliefs kind of like stay there and push back against the change that you'd hope to see. So that's the problem that I'm concerned with. And I think it shows up in all sorts of places where you try to implement a measure and it faces pushback or backlash that leads things to stay kind of more or less the same.
So it's kind of like, even if we have these implementations or these like structural changes, as the paper posits, there's still going to be like a bias or like things that would still kind of show prejudice towards whatever group there is, right?
Yeah. It could be about prejudice, but it could also be about other things, like, maybe it's not about prejudice, maybe it's about economic inequality or something, and people just kind of like resist a particular change. So it could be about all sorts of changes. The idea is like, if people are sufficiently motivated to have things stay exactly the way they are, that's going to be a problem for implementing change. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then I guess my next question is kind of like, um, isn't there a necessity to like change both? Like, don't you need to
Yes.
also target like the structural idea, like where I think it's at least a good step from just like a surface level understanding of it. I think it's a good step for there to be a law in order to like implement here, but also like a change in the context of like what we need to do or what we need to think our own beliefs, right? So how
Yeah.
are we like able to do both? Is one better than the other? Like, what is the evaluation or like the conclusion the paper kind of led to, or your
Yeah.
research rather?
So I think that we often need to do both, exactly because of, because I think often we're not going to go very far just by changing people's beliefs, because a lot of social problems also reside in just structures. So, if a space at a university isn't accessible to certain groups of disabled students, you can't just like, make everyone feel like warm and fuzzy about disabled people isn't gonna, change on its own, change the fact that there isn't a ramp there. So we do need a lot of like material and structural change, but I also think that we are gonna need like individual level belief change. So obviously we need individual level belief change for people who are responsible for implementing policies, or sort of like lead, or enough kind of social pressure to lead them to do so, which requires, specific people to like really care about an issue. Yeah. So I don't see these two as opposed. I think that we're gonna need to kind of think about both of them. And sort of that's kind of like where the paper goes. But part of what the paper is trying to do is help us think about how changing people's beliefs and changing people's minds might not be such a kind of like, might not be best done by just thinking about minds in isolation. Um, so in particular, the idea is that sometimes if we want to address people's prejudices, and these like resistant social beliefs, what we're going to need to do is have broader changes to the social networks in which people are. So these are going to be changes that are kind of like larger than any specific individual. So the paper is kind of meant to resist an emphasis on interventions that are very individualistic, like implicit bias trainings, or the sort of like, corporate, mid-level corporate trainings that you might have to do at your job that just tell you like, how you should act or what you should think in certain situations. So I think that that's not that likely to be effective, though it's still a tool that maybe should be on the table. I think that's an empirical question, but I think that our focus should be more on kind of larger structural changes, even when it comes to changing individual minds.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. And I guess I was just thinking while you were talking about like how different groups might be, looked against or discriminated against, and how structural change might be necessary to like create more diverse atmospheres or whatever. And so my question, kind of like obviously being a high school student, is related to like colleges
Yeah.
with the recent like affirmative action, Supreme Court case, and like how they're currently, or at least I think there's an expected ban on affirmative action. So like
Mm.
was affirmative action or like these like types of policies that force colleges or like force kind of diversity, is that counterintuitive to the actual like idea of bringing more diversity into colleges or into spaces? Do you kind of get
Gosh,
where like the question is?
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really hard question. And like, I should note that like, there's lots to think about affirmative action that I don't know about, but I do have some thoughts on it. So I think one aspect in which affirmative action is interesting for this project is that it is exactly the kind of, you might think of it as a structural measure. It's sort of about the rules that universities use in deciding admissions. And it's exactly the kind of structural measure that it brings and has brought and continues to bring huge amounts of backlash. So you can sort of see that as a kind of like resistant social beliefs case. So like, individual resistant social beliefs about things like meritocracy or certain groups' own right or entitlement to be in privileged spaces over others. those things lead people to like resist these measures, which, you know, you might think if they were implemented would lead to kind of like a more equal society over time. So that's one connection. Is like, it raises the question, what can we do to address those sorts of beliefs that lead people to resist affirmative action? Another connection is that this is somewhat idealized at the very least, but I think that college campuses have a lot of potential as spaces for kind of like valuable social integration, mixing, and contact. And I think that affirmative action, if, you know, done well, so that it actually benefits students from a wide range of kind of racial, economic, geographical, etc. backgrounds, can really contribute to that, can contribute to like college campuses being places that have a wider range of people and provide kind of room for intergroup contact. So this is some stuff about like why I think intergroup contact is important. This draws on some research in psychology. So it's kind of well studied. This started with kind of Gordon Allport in the 50s, that social contact between kind of social groups that are often kind of segregated in kind of like positive collaborative conditions is something that leads to reductions in individual level prejudice. So that's kind of like one reason you might think it's important to have such spaces. But another kind of related reason is that I think contact between people of different groups can help us kind of like abandon certain resistant social beliefs. So the idea is that, and this is sort of what the paper tries to establish, the idea is that in many cases, we are defensive about certain of our beliefs because they're connected to social identities that matter a lot to us. So this is kind of like pretty obvious that people can be very defensive when people say something bad about like their country, or I don't know, even their like sports team. And that's because like they have this like strong sense of identification and affiliation with that group. So what happens when you mix people from different groups? Well, what tends to happen is that those people, they start to think of themselves in a way that's a little more subtle, not just as like members of this particular team or religious group or ethnic or racial group, but also like of more inclusive groups that include all sorts of different people. And so what's gonna, I think, often happen in those cases, or at least space for that, is that there's kind of a reduction in defensiveness. You're like maybe less defensive about your sense of about your like national identity or about your race, because you now have to balance out that kind of important affiliation or group belonging with kind of other groups that also matter to you. Yeah, so that's kind of the thought. It's that some measures that lead to more intergroup contact can make people sort of more open to evidence by making them kind of like less stuck on just being part of one social group and attempting to defend that at all costs. Yeah. And then there's like a lot of, this is just what kind of I see as like more related to my paper. Oh, just one more thing. I think college campuses can be like a really good atmosphere for this kind of intergroup contact, because they're sort of, they provide a lot of opportunities for positive structured contact, both through classrooms, which when kind of well designed are spaces where people can have like really respectful, engaged, deep discussions, and also through sort of like, you know, sports teams, clubs, like other interactions that people can have in this kind of in a space that hopefully is sort of a like safe and enriching kind of space. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think that like makes sense. Especially like I don't know, it's just like a pressing question, I think, right now, just to kind of think about. Especially as you know, a lot of the youth who might be listening to this kind of relate to those types of questions and how it might impact them. But I think you bring up a really good point about how like talking with different types of groups of people can actually promote kind of like a good exchange and like change how you believe about different things. Most notably is like if you're not acquainted with a specific view, but you are meeting someone who is acquainted with that view, obviously you're going to try to learn a little bit more about it. And I'm curious if this is the same way that structuralism is actually able to provide some sort of a relief to resistant social change, or sorry, resistance belief. Is that how it's able to do that, or
Yeah.
is that like the conclusion?
Yeah, so there's a few different things. The way what I'm interested in is sort of like um what I'm most interested in that paper is like how contact with other groups can kind of like break down our internal resistances to changing our minds because it makes us kind of less defensive. So that's what I'm most interested in. But there's other things that are arguably at least as important. So one of them you might think is just that you get exposed to more information. You were in an environment where you didn't know people with these different experiences. Now you get to talk to them, you learn new things, and that changes your mind, at least if you're not super defensive, which is why addressing the defensiveness aspect of things is still important. Another thing that matters is that it might change, you make friends. It's not just that you meet and listen to these people in this like abstract environment. No, you like make friends with them. You come to trust these new people, and trust is really important for whether we rely on what others say. So it might be that you had heard some of these experiences before, but you hadn't taken them super seriously. But now that it's your friends and people you really trust, that's now much more likely to affect you. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess like I have a follow-up question,
Yeah.
which honestly thinking about this is like really confusing. But I guess if you have structuralist actions that kind of bring more diversity about just by like virtue of requiring it or something like
Mhm.
that, which means that people who may have resistant beliefs or social beliefs are required to discuss with different types of groups that they might have resistant beliefs
Yeah.
on. Isn't it a necessity to have those discussions in the first place? So like, how do we get
Yeah.
across like that discussion? Because I feel like there's still a lot of stigma behind certain discussions in the workplace, most notably about like feminism in the workplace. Like there's a lot of discussion, or like I guess rather a lack of discussion about like what that means to have a coworker that is that identifies as a woman. Like how do we promote those discussions in those places? Is that something that we need to do on our own? Is that something that needs to be embedded within the structural change? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely think that, there's a risk that you kind of put people from different groups together and maybe get them to talk about these kinds of contentious issues that lead to lots of defensiveness, and that things just go horribly wrong, that people just like say awful things to one another and get more entrenched. I think, that's a risk, but I also think that we can't um get to that much progress without having at least some of those conversations. So I think the question becomes how we can create an environment where those conversations can be had. And also not thinking about any of this stuff as kind of like one shot effort. The idea is not that you have like one conversation once and people change their minds. The idea is that you're going to be able to hopefully shift people's minds slowly. Um, and also only if you do it kind of in the right context, in a context where trust has been established, where there's a kind of collaborative feel, where like you're not going to be socially ostracized for saying the wrong thing or being ignorant of something, and so on. As for how it can be achieved, I mean, I'm not that well, there's kind of two extremes that I think we need to be careful to like focus on excessively. One is the sort of like idea that you can just like as an individual by yourself heroically change all of these things. The other one is the idea that you should just like rely on kind of institutional change. The institutions kind of don't change very fast by themselves, and their kind of interests are often in kind of protecting their own reputation and so on. So I think there's something intermediate, which is usually kind of something in the form of a social movement. So social movement is sort of a coordinated action between lots of people around a particular goal. And those kind of have the advantage, they have a lot of advantages, but one of them is that they sort of show that maybe a belief or an idea that everyone was taking for granted and thought that everyone else also believed that. It's like, oh no, actually lots of people don't think that. It kind of destabilizes things and opens up space for questioning. It also can show you that it's sort of safe for you to adopt this new idea because like lots of other people also have it. Um, yeah. So I think, it's like we need to be kind of thinking at these like three different levels. But I think like it's good to think about this intermediate level quite a bit as a way of sort of bringing together people who are each interested in the same goal, and then as a way of pressuring institutions into sort of more robust change that becomes kind of longer lasting because it's like embedded in the structure of how things are run.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. And I guess like for anyone like watching or listening, I think like thinking about the relationship between kind of how like the structure or like kind of higher order like states or whatever it might be, whether it's like the organization or the corporation or actual like governmental change, how those things kind of intersect with your own personal ideals, and like how we can get those discussions out inside of the places that you're in, because I think that's really important. But I'm also interested in your writing about social networks, and it's kind of been brought up already in our discussions. So like what role do social networks play in determining access to evidence and like the trustworthiness of sources? Is this kind of like confirmation biased, or like the filter bubbles, or like an echo chamber where it's like you're constantly receiving information that you agree with, so you're not able to see different views, and so whenever you do see those views you end up like not evaluating or thinking it's fake? Is that kind of what it is?
Yeah. So I think there's at least like three kind of effects that we can separate, though in real life they kind of all come together. I think it's useful to separate them, even though they come together in real life, because they each require their own intervention. So we need to be thinking about each of them. So like one effect is just what Thi Nguyen calls just a filter bubble. That's just where you're not getting information about something. So this is true. We're all in filter bubbles of some sort or another. Like, I don't know that much. I don't know much about what's going on politically in East Africa. I just the information sources I read don't tell me much about that. And I guess I also don't seek out that information because doesn't feel very relevant to me and to like people in my life. So like we all have things like that, or like, I don't know that much about particle physics, etc. So you might think social networks matter for that because we get a lot of our information these days from our social networks. Some people like to say that the internet has just become like 4 websites, all of which are social networks pretty much. That's going to matter. So your social network constrains what information you end up getting by just sort of being passive. So that's one thing. Thing number 2 has got to do with who you trust. So in some cases, obviously it's like we trust our friends. People typically also like people are kind of like more similar to us along a bunch of lines, and more broadly people in our social networks more than we trust those who are not. And so it might be that even if we then get information from someone outside of our social network, we don't trust it very much because, we it's like, who's this person? And like, maybe they don't have the right kinds of identity markers that you associate with someone seeming trustworthy. Like maybe they don't speak in the right way that sounds trustworthy to you. So that's another kind of issue has got to do with trust as opposed to just access to evidence. And notice that when people when you don't trust someone, it doesn't really help for them to tell you more stuff because you don't trust them. So like what you need to do to address that is sort of get people to or become more trusting, or get others to become more trusting, or more trusting of the right people, at least the people who are actually trustworthy. And so this comes up. Also notice that when it comes to like prejudice, because prejudice is a really important reason why we sometimes don't trust people. So think about sexist prejudices leading people to not rely much on what women say. Same about like racist prejudices and how those especially might target people who speak in a certain accent or a certain dialect of English and so on. So like those are, we might think that people aren't credible when in fact they're credible. They're experts in what they're talking about. Last thing that I think happens with social networks is that, gosh, maybe I have 2 more things. One more thing that happens with social networks is that they can lead us to become more defensive, as I was saying. So the thought here is that the more you're just interacting with a kind of relatively sealed off group of people that is relatively uniform and sees itself as kind of opposed to others, it's kind of like you're gonna have this like strong sense of belonging to this in group. This is really important to you. It becomes a big part of who you are, that you're like this kind of person. And so two things happen. Often these groups have sort of like beliefs that are the good ones to have and the bad ones to have. So like you're not gonna want to have the bad beliefs. So there you might engage in things like what you're calling confirmation bias, like you might just really avoid getting any information that would challenge you having the right beliefs for that group. You like cover your ears and try to not hear it. Or like if you get any arguments, you just sort of like try really hard to show how they're wrong, and things like that. Yeah. So at that level, I think we get some of the confirmation bias stuff, but I think the other stuff is a little bit different. Yeah. One more thing, if we're talking about social networks as online spaces, I think there's other interesting stuff that has to do with how they kind of like shape our attention. So these are spaces where you're expected to sort of get information very quickly. You're just kind of mindlessly scrolling. And that doesn't lead exactly, it's not like the best venue for very subtle debate. So it kind of leads to positions getting kind of becoming caricatures of themselves. And so you're not actually, it's kind of like the emotional dials go up and the detail in the argument and how much you're actually reconsidering things goes down. And that's a virtue of sort of like the way in which these spaces are designed and how that shapes our attention. So that would be, like addressed by changing that design. So maybe we should just be like old school and all go back to blogs. Maybe that's happening now that Twitter's dying.
So do you think this is also like true with how like there's kind of like, and I guess I'm a part of this because we create clips of our podcast, but like kind of having like headlines and more people are just reading headlines on social media as opposed to actually getting to the root of the argument, as well as kind of like the different polarized channels or media outlets that you're subscribed to, and how those types of like the rhetoric that they're utilizing is specifically kind of ingraining our own biases, and in stabilizing those biases, as opposed to kind of grabbing information from a lot of different sources and reconciling with that. Is that kind of like what type of reflections are needed in order to kind of change our own resistant social biases if you have them?
Yeah. So you mean sort of like kind of like having a really wide informational diet, basically? Yeah. I mean, here's what I think the ideal informational diet would be. Unfortunately, it's not something that you can just choose to do. It would be just like you read all and only the really good sources. So like, it's not that wide because there's a lot of like trash out there. So you're not looking at any of the trash. Unfortunately, it's tricky because it's kind of like you might think you don't know in advance what's trash and what isn't. It's very hard for basically all of us to know who the experts are without ourselves being experts in things. So you might think that, I think there's really interesting questions to explore here, but you might think that part of the strategy has got to involve a little bit of like exploring, but then also being somewhat constrained. Part of the reason why you might worry about being wholly open or wholly exploratory in those ways is that kind of like trash sources they're not just trash, they're often propagandistic. So they're like designed to sort of like be flashy, get at your emotions, grab your attention, make you feel outraged, connect to your sense of self, all of that. And there's good like evidence from psychology that, well, both that those things kind of are more memorable and more engaging and feel like games that we want to keep playing when we engage with them, but also that like often when we read something, even if we know it's not true, we kind of end up believing it. It's like we kind of forget where we heard that from, and we just remember that we saw that somewhere. So there's a risk to kind of going around reading and consuming kind of like really bad sources as well.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. And I guess there's actually like some future questions that I think are really interesting, kind of the relationship between different social groups and like misinformation, and
Yeah.
how honestly there could be like some sort of cognitive like rewiring almost about like what your opinions are. And I think that's actually really curious, but or like really interesting to explore rather. But I did want to ask, because I think that a lot of your writing focuses on like more of optimistic ideas for personal and social change. So why is optimism good? And you know, like some sort of like opinions against optimism, or like that it could lead to continuous cycles of disappointment when social
Yeah.
movements fail. So like, why should people, especially young people, who are seeing kind of like
Yeah.
differences in social, like in government, in politics, especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, like why should we be optimistic for
Yeah.
change?
So, I mean, I agree that we're at a political moment, and I think young people feel this especially acutely. That's not super hopeful. I think of, climate change and what we know about what's basically going to happen over the next few decades is not a great reason to be like optimistic. Also, sort of, mass and increasing economic inequality, So I don't think, when you look at those things, it's like, I don't think the world is looking like it's in an upward trajectory, particularly. And I don't think it's like we should be delusionally optimistic and like ignore the facts. I think it's extremely important to recognize how things are going. At the same time, I think it's important, if we're gonna act in the world, to have some hope in the future. Like if you're completely hopeless, you're not going to even try to do anything, basically. So I think that's one role for hope or optimism. It's sort of like recognizing that things might be difficult, but that they're worth doing, and that if we kind of group together, we have a chance of doing so. I think it's not my work, but like I think a space where there's a lot of room for optimism, and I see some activism turning into this, is like sometimes thinking of what we're doing as trying out experiments in living. So even if you don't succeed at changing the world writ large, you can kind of succeed at changing a microenvironment, succeed at changing ways of life in a narrower world, and kind of generate experiments that can help us all in the future do better. My work, there's a specific brand of optimism that I'm interested in, and it's sort of like measured optimism about human minds and human rationality in particular. So the idea is, I think there's some people out there, and I think we saw this a lot in sort of the post 2016 post Trump election world, who were very upset at all of this happening, obviously, and um, who kind of blamed it all on ordinary people kind of not caring about truth and being like stupid and childish and unable to reason and too easy to manipulate and whatever. And some people went as far as kind of taking this in a kind of anti-democratic direction. Like maybe we shouldn't, let all of these people like vote and make these important political decisions. So I think that's completely wrong-headed. And on a psychological level, I think that it's because people are not fundamentally stupid or uninterested in the truth. I think we're built to be interested in the truth, and I think we're built to like learn and adapt to our environments. So I think we have to kind of recognize that, and that gives us some room for optimism, which is like there are those things there in everyone's minds that can be tapped into. Now, that might not be easy. So I'm not an optimist as in like, oh, look, actually everyone is really rational and doing the right thing all the time. The idea here is that there's room for us to try to think really creatively about what we can do to kind of bring out everyone's best side. So it's optimistic in that sense. It's like, yeah, it's going to be really hard work. It might be disappointing, but if you have a vision for the future that you think is very valuable, there is room for it to succeed at some scale or other, and you should keep trying.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I agree. Obviously, as a student, I think I have to agree right now. But I do want to wrap things up with the final question about what do you do now? Like, just I've asked all my guests about this. Just, maybe if it's like some research, maybe it's some like social, sort of social or like service or whatever. So what are you doing now?
Yeah, so I finished my PhD in May, and I moved to California. I'm splitting my time between LA and Lisbon these days. And yeah, I'm trying to do more research on the role of social identities in our thinking, and sort of different ways in which we can relate to our social identities, and what might be some really like valuable ways we can do so, especially for progressive social change. Um, yeah, so that's the main thing that's keeping me busy these days.
Yeah, I mean that's awesome. And I think that move is great. Hopefully, I think California is honestly probably one of the best states in my opinion. But um, that's about it for this episode. I did want to say thank you so much again, Dr. Flores, for your time. I
Thank
learned a
you.
lot, and I think there's a lot of interesting questions that if anyone wants to explore or at least reflect over, there's a lot of content that we covered today, and I would encourage everyone to go out to Dr. Flores' website, read some of her more research, and also just maybe comment, see what you learned, and that would be really really awesome. So thank you.
Thank you.